At this point in our careers, I know many of us are looking for mentors. So I'd love to hear how you've found mentors and how helpful they've been to you in your career.
So I think, again, it goes back to a little bit to that pen pal thing. I've tried doing the Stanford programs where I've mentored students here, and I have to admit, I don't sign up for them anymore just because I found it really didn't, we can go walk and I can give you advice and that's sort of it, The flip side is when you can find something to coalesce around, when you can find an alumni student group where there's an activity or a conference or something like that that you can work on together. I find those work really well. For me, I really found my mentors in two places. One is in work, where I was doing business with someone and decided they were a smart person and I wanted to attach myself to them. So, if I think about my mentors, people like Ann Winblad, who I got to know early on and who we were Hummer Winblad's first investment, so then she was on my board. Bill Gates, who I, worked with closely when, and competed with way back in the beginning of the personal computer revolution, and, got to know him and got to do some business with Microsoft, and so got to know him better. Other folks that I literally met here, Fred Gibbons and Trip Hawkins, and people that actually came and spoke to the business school. And then when I started my company, I would get in touch with them, and I ended up doing business with their companies. The other thing is, I decided to, and I strongly recommend this, I decided to get involved in the trade associations of the industries I was in. So. Early on in the personal computer industry, there was something called the Software Publishers Association, which was kind of funny because there weren't very many software publishers. So it was kind of funny that we had this industry association. And in fact, the way I found out about it is we had this user of one of our products, and she would call in all the time, and she was in her, I don't know, 70s or 80s. She was not a young woman, and personal computer user in 1983, 84, when you're in your 70s or whatever, that's really highly unusual. It's a lot more common now, but it wasn't then. And she would always say to me, my nephew Kenny is starting this group of people like you. And she just kept saying, my nephew Kenny, and I thought, oh God, this woman, she seriously, I'm not kidding. She lived in like a mobile home park in Utah or something, and she was telling me that her nephew Kenny was starting this software club or something. I thought, okay, fine, have your nephew Kenny call me. And it turned out that it was this guy Ken Wash in Washington, D.C., who started this thing called the Software Publishers Association. And so I got involved with that, and then that grew and became a very prominent organization. And I got involved in the leadership of that. I ran for the board, and I was elected to the board. And I ended up serving on that board for 8 years. I was president for 2. And then subsequently, I did the same thing with the National Venture Capital Association and rose onto the board. And I was actually elected chairman of that. Ultimately, I stepped down because I wasn't going to stay in venture capital, and I thought it would be really weird to be chairman of the National Venture Capital Association and not be a venture capitalist. So I proactively stepped down from that position, but I got elected. The thing about a trade association is, they're a lot of work and you don't get paid to do them. But the connections you make and the contacts you make and your presence in the industry ends up being so much vaster and greater than whatever might be merited by the size of your company alone. So, Teamaker was this little piddly company that sort of nobody cared about, but yet I was on the board of the trade association, and I got to testify before the Senate on the Software Rental Act. I got to go to Japan and represent the United States software industry. I got to do all these interesting things, and I got to meet the other leaders of the software industry who were, I was sitting on that board with people who had much, much bigger companies than I did. And those were people who I ended up getting to know. The same thing with the NVCA. I ended up being on the board with other venture capitalists who had deal flow, right? Which is really nice, and who had money to invest in my companies. And so I ended up doing business with those people. So I'm a big proponent of trade associations, in spite of the fact that they are sort of bureaucratic and and you don't get paid to do it, and they're really long hours. But I really think that they benefit you. I think the other thing is it gets your head out of your own daily business. And I know, particularly in Silicon Valley, maybe not so much anymore, but back in the Stone Ages when I was starting a company, we really thought of Washington and government and the feds and all that as all those really stupid people on the other coast that just stay out of our way and leave us alone. And the more I got involved in trade associations, the more I started to understand the connection between government and governmental policy and what actually happens at my little company and my ability to create jobs and things like visas and taxation and how they slice up broadband and how they regulate things really do impact your little company in ways that are rather alarming sometimes and rather wonderful sometimes if you can figure out how to be on the right side of that equation. So for me, it opened my eyes to a lot of things that as a small entrepreneur I would have said, oh God, who cares what those people in Washington do anyway? Well, now I care a lot more about what those people in Washington do. There's a reason why, Google and Microsoft and Cisco and whatever have offices and employees and all those sitting in Washington, because it really, really, really matters.